Hello, Emilia. Hi. Thank you for joining us today. I'm so excited.
Hi, I'm so excited as well. Hi, Francesca.
Hi. Now, we have so many questions from people, and I think it's exciting to get some answers from someone like yourself who's done this for so many years and you really do know. Let's just jump right in and I'll ask you the first question if that's okay, because this was a really hot topic and one we got a lot. It's what is the top challenge schools with numbers of BMLs face when it comes to literacy?
There's quite a lot of challenges actually, and I want to extend that a little bit. It's not just about any particular type of a school. It's actually, if you think about the nature of international schools, maybe back in the day in the 80s or 90s, the ELL population was something of a minority. And then there was a different way of kind of approaching that as a topic in education. Whereas nowadays, if you look about the very nature of international schools, it's the landscape is very different. What's happening is that you have less and less of the expats and you have more and more of the local or kind of the region
Yeah.
student body or student population represented. So the very nature of international schools has changed, and you have a lot of BML students in all schools. So for example, let's say my school in Singapore, we did a little bit of research in terms of the data, and we found that there was a significant increase in just a matter of like 3 years, the number of students who were BML whose first language was not English grew about 20 to 30%. So from
Wow.
like 30 or 40% to like 60. Now 60 is kind of like a big difference, right? So
That's a
what that
significant difference.
exactly. So that means that then the majority of the students are the ones that have those needs. And then the school needs to be very smart in terms of how they meet the needs of these students. So I think that's the number one challenge, is that the landscape in international schools has changed. And people in general, just like anywhere else, are a bit slow in responding to this.
Yeah.
And the reason behind that is that international schools, by very nature, do not necessarily recruit local teachers. And it's supposed to be a mix, right? But then the mix actually becomes the people from the top five English speaking countries. They come in, they're normally monolingual, and they don't understand really the needs and the changing landscape. So I think that's where the clash is. You have on one side, you have the need that's very much present in international schools because of their very nature that has changed.
Yeah.
And then you have people who are coming in to meet their needs, but they're not necessarily skilled or trained in any of these practices. So my background is in linguistics. So I would kind of come in and start a conversation with people, and they would be like, oh, wow, that's such a novel idea. I'm like, no, it's not. It's actually just kind of like your bread and butter, right?
Yeah.
It's not
That should
something.
be.
Right. It's not novel to me, but to many
Yeah.
people it is. And that's because
Yeah.
their training is very different. And then you have this kind of not even mix, but you have like a group that's kind of very I guess homogeneous in terms of their understanding of the needs of BMLs and having that mindset, I guess.
Yeah.
So it becomes very hard. And I think that's where the lack of awareness is one problem that we see now. However, I would say, or maybe more accurately, that was like 5 to 10 years ago. And now people are like, okay, this is happening. What do we
Good.
do now? Suddenly everybody's kind of rushing and trying to figure out what to do. And obviously the medical model for supporting BMLs is no longer working. So then what do we do?
What does that look like now?
Right. So lots of research has gone into that. Things have changed significantly in terms of being more inclusive with our practices and all of that, but I still feel the very nature of the problem still persists, that we have two very different groups, and everybody now talks about culturally responsive teaching and learning, making sure, we're kind of responsive to the population that we have in front of us, but at the same time, that very same population and the parent expectations are somewhat
That's
different. right? So when you ask your parents, they say, we want our children to actually get into UK universities or US universities. So then you have this kind of mix because you're trying to meet the needs of parents and give them what they want.
Yeah.
But they don't always know what they want, because obviously they want first for their child to be happy and to be successful, and to have all of these barriers and learning removed, and for their child to be accepted with their whole self. Because when you talk about language, it's not just language, it's about culture, it's about bringing your whole
Identity.
school, right? So that
Yeah.
whole, now again, intersectionality and, the different kind of layers to your personality. Then you add TCKs on top of that, third culture kids.
So I'm saying it's so complex. It's so dimensional. I think what's interesting though, that principals, I think in schools, I mean, they have if you have a certain curriculum that you want to teach, you would look to maybe the top 5 English speaking countries. And that's basically the norm. But as you were touching upon earlier, I think it's very true that these countries, very often they're monolingual. Yes. And I think I was reading somewhere very recently that I always say, how weird is your school? And by weird, I mean that very often the staff are Western educated, they come from industrialized, rich, democratic countries, right? And so the staff, the principals and the administrators hire staff who come from this background, but they're working with children who don't come from that language background or those cultures. But they really need to be trained in understanding what second language or bilingual development looks like in our students, and take that information and then apply that into the classrooms. And also, I think with parents too, because parents, as you were saying, parents come with the understanding that they want their child to be bilingual. That's wonderful, or have an international mindset.
Yeah.
But they really don't know what that journey step by step looks like. And I think, again, part of the school's role is to educate the parents in, yes, your child's going to struggle when it comes to certain parts at certain stages of their linguistic development. And I think your data can really support that. That's where it's key, right?
Yeah. And I think the data is kind of a way to start that conversation, to create that sense of urgency, I guess. So very often, like when we talk about school development and whatnot, we say, okay, we need to be moving towards adaptive change and all of that. And I completely agree if your school is at that point in their journey. But what happens if the needs of the BMLs are not met at all? Or they're not met to, or you don't have like solid processes in place. So then what needs to happen is that the data conversation needs to come first. So once you have solid data, it's not about opinions, it's about
facts.
The facts, right? What is the information that you can glean from all the data collected? And I'm not talking about quantitative data only. There's obviously the home language survey. There's obviously parent expectations that you can kind of lean into to understand the family dynamics, expectations, and all of that. I kind of touched on that, but different families have different expectations, right? Some want their children, as you said, to be bilingual. Others are coming like maybe they've lived in a country for 20 years, so their children, the mother and the father, maybe the parents, are coming from a certain culture, but their kids are not, and their language is, they haven't developed it in that particular context. It's in a different place. So that in itself holds lots of challenges. So I think it's important to always start with what is the available information? What are you looking into so that you can kind of understand? And when I say that, it doesn't have to be like before we were having that data conversation on kind of finding the gap. So kind of like gap analysis almost. Now what I've been kind of striving towards is more of an appreciative inquiry standpoint. So kind of starting with the data, but also finding the positives. What are our strengths? What do we do well? It doesn't have to be a negative conversation, right? It can be something where this is what we're really good at. how can we do more of that? Because I'm pretty sure every single school now has the beginnings in terms of like awareness about needs of BMLs, awareness in terms of, or some services, some practices in place, and then they need to do, or pockets of excellence, right?
That's
Something
right.
happening around the school. So you just kind of have
Yeah.
to tap into that as a resource and amplify it. So if you kind of have that standpoint, then it's very easy to use the numbers and to create rich data stories that actually not just like, it's not just the number, it's actually a person that's connected to it. So it has a
Absolutely.
name and it has a story, and we want to
Yeah.
support that.
One of the things that I think that's so true. And one of the things that I always say to schools is, why don't you do a survey on the languages that your staff speak? That
Yes.
alone, right? That brings out all these, secrets and wonderful. I mean, I remember one of the schools I was in recently, and an English lady said, "Oh yeah, I speak fluent Farsi." Now, by looking at her, the teacher who teaches English, you would never have assumed in a million years. And yet there we have someone who's a fluent Farsi speaker, and therefore could help any of the students that came in who perhaps needed some assistance at any stages along their linguistic development. And
And
I
it's not
think,
just about supporting the students, it's also about the richness, right? And
yeah,
celebrating diversity and representation, because Farsi might be, something that a student might need. Let's say my cultural background, Macedonian, I guess, that's not gonna help anybody necessarily when I work in East Asia or when I work
yeah,
in the East. There's not really a great need for that, but it's about the representation and the celebration of the small cultures, the small languages, and the richness that they bring to the world. And I think it's also that sense of belonging, because especially as you mentioned, we've done that mother tongue initiative in my previous school as well. It was about the cleaning staff, it was about the kitchen
that's
staff
right.
coming together and actually talking to students. They felt so proud. They were coming back with gifts or whatnot, and they were so grateful. And they even shared that that was the first time that they felt seen and heard. So it's about that whole thing that you want people to bring their whole selves to school, whether it's their
Absolutely.
workplace or school place. It's about creating that sense of belonging that we all talk about a lot. There's one thing about improving I guess the linguistic capacity or capability of students, and that's absolutely valid, and we definitely need to do that. But I think the underlying kind of thing is about recognizing their identity and in having
Seeing
them
them.
feel like, yes, seeing them and seeing that they're there. And we might not necessarily always find the best way and the highest impact strategy to support them, but if you start with that, with the humans kind of approach first, then I think everything kind of falls into place. And you're going to make lots of mistakes along the way, and you're
Of
going to
course.
have agreements in terms of what needs to be done, when, with what intensity, how often, whatever. But those are technicalities. I think the intentions have to be there first in terms of this is what we're trying to accomplish, and kind of learning along the way, I guess.
Yeah, and I think when the children are seen, they feel that they can then belong to the school, belong in the classroom, and then the learning starts.
Yes.
And I think with most curriculums nowadays, I mean, the idea that teachers go abroad and they are working abroad means that they want to experience themselves living in another culture. So they're
Yes.
open to that, right?
Yes.
And I think that, yes, there are pressures that we, as you're saying, we want to get students to, to certain levels or have certain results by certain dates. But I think that there's a journey there where if you are looking at the child and you're bringing them along, accepting who they are, acknowledging their background or lack of the information, I think it's
Mhm.
always so enlightening when you talk about a topic and then you get another child's perspective, because from their culture they're looking at it through a different lens, and
Yes.
then that lends itself to creating this neutral space where, well, I'm not the dominant culture
Mhm.
or idea here, you're
Mhm.
bringing a really important one, and they feel safe to do that, and then that creates this new learning space where everybody grows.
And that also is very much connected. I've been thinking a lot lately about the whole notion and the whole idea and the language that we use around it, I guess, about the target language. Or the dominant language or whatnot. And those are, facts that you cannot avoid necessarily, but the language that we use around them can certainly kind of shape realities and change things for us.
Absolutely.
You said, like, once you create that neutral space, I think it's very much, that's the start, because whenever we kind of plan all of these, what educators love calling like interventions of some sort, we're kind of relying on the teacher as the only carrier of knowledge, as the only person who's able to support that child. And we're not tapping into the rest of the resources. We're not looking in motivation for learning as well. And are we going to inspire someone to learn? Are we looking at peer learning as well and what they learn from their peers as well? And it's not just about books. It's not just about, the basic language, the playground language, the kitchen language or whatnot. Kids learn academic language from each other as well. But we need to create the space for that to happen.
That's wonderful. That's really good, isn't it? That's exciting.
Yeah,
Really.
it is. And scary at the same time, but
Yeah, well,
it requires somewhat of letting go of control. So I've worked with quite a few teachers who were like, but I don't understand what they're saying. They might be saying something bad, like they might be saying something bad in English. Like, what's the difference, right?
Yeah, I think,
like, don't always assume it's going to be negative or bad.
yeah. And I think teachers need to just have the confidence. That's what I always say a lot of times is become more educated. For example, get some BML training or get second language training so that you can, second language acquisition training, so that you can then be able to take a step back and allow the learning to happen through the children, as you're saying, through their peer interaction with each other, rather than you always be the font of it or in control of it, right?
Yeah.
I think that's key. Really good.
Absolutely.
Okay. There's another question. Well, that's only the question one. Can you imagine? Okay, so knowing that the schools that, I know the schools that you've been at previously, and I know you were in Singapore and you did fabulous work there. Honestly, really fabulous work. So what kind of success have you experienced yourself when implementing, for example, literacy policies and practices within schools that you've worked in?
So actually, if you come with that intention that you are going to, first of all, come from a position of care, the results come themselves. They're actually kind of like a side effect or a byproduct of what you're trying to do as a process. So what we did more specifically was we started with the whole idea of the data, obviously, but also knowing the importance of leveled reading, all the way, I would say, to 8th grade for sure. I think that was kind of the highest impact strategy in terms of like accelerated progress and closing achievement gaps and whatnot. So that practice in itself, where you create small groups and you encourage at the same time listening and speaking skills, or oracy if you come from a different part of the world, word work if it's integrated within that, then you have inevitably lots of success. Then you have, and that process does not happen by itself. It's actually professional learning for teachers as well, or professional development, and at the same time, a student success. And when we did that, what teachers reported, because we did lots of surveys as well in terms of, so we measured our success in terms of the numbers, but we also measured perception in the people experience, I guess. So we asked teachers about what was kind of their starting point and what were their beliefs and how they changed over time. And what they said was that the increased teacher efficacy was something that really was very strong in the information that we collected, because they were all saying that they feel so much more comfortable as reading teachers than reading teachers of BMLs. And I think that was something that was really strong. Then we didn't stop there. We continued with a slightly different approach in terms of writing, where we opened up, I guess, the floor for students to bring their own identity, their own selves into the classroom as well. So we did writing workshop with the idea that kids always had a choice in terms of writing. They could also write in their mother tongue, or they could write in English as well. But that just opening up the floor, so having that consistency in terms of support and small group instruction, and then enriching that experience with that layer of kind of writing workshop, that really was so powerful, because they had a way to express themselves. So we started with the kind of the theory or the idea by Ruth Sims, that, writing or books are kind of a mirror into somebody else's world, and a door into yours. So it was kind of about, bringing your whole self and expressing yourself in writing. And that is a strategy. Guided reading or leveled readers is a strategy. That's not just, good practice for BMLs. That is good practice for all children. So when you start with those things, everybody got to enjoy it, and they were all super excited to be a part of the literacy classes. Even my own children who were a part of that school, they still keep talking about, how powerful literacy instruction was in that school. And to this day, they're voracious readers. They love reading and they love writing. They want to publish a book or whatnot. So it's just about, I guess, creating the positive self-image that you are a reader, you are a writer. And then it starts with that. And we've seen so many successes with that. But when we talk also, we had the qualitative data in terms of perceptions, and then we also had the hardcore numbers because we measured that as well. So what we found was, in terms of the reading assessments that we did in that particular context, that was DRAs, we had an increase between 20 to 40% in different grade levels in just a year. So that was a lot in terms of kind of accelerated progress, closing achievement gaps. We had many more children reading on grade level, and we had teachers who also knew how to teach reading and writing. So I think that was kind of the biggest impact. We also had the MAP assessment as well, which many schools are using. So then what that showed us was that the conditional, we tracked the data over time. So it was the first time that we had a positive conditional growth index. We had lots of improvement, in particular grade levels, especially grade 1 and grade 2. In terms of growth, they were in the 97th to the 99th percentile, which means that's the highest you can go, right? So it was huge improvements.
Huge.
And especially for that profile of a school that is well established, that is a school that has very high academic expectations normally. And that was including all students, as I said, the high achievers, everybody was included in that. It wasn't just, kids who can make progress, it was everybody. And that was something that some people had suspicions about at the beginning, but I think engaging in that process, it became very apparent and clear that what we were doing was working.
But I think, absolutely, I think that the data doesn't lie, right? When you look at the scores, you can see that. But I think what's interesting is that when you do good literacy practice in a school, it's so imperative for BMLs that we have a strong literacy program going, but it benefits everybody.
Everybody.
So when you everybody, there's nobody, you may say we need this because we have a strong BML number of children in our school, but then even if you have accelerated readers, they even benefit more. And I think that's the key, is it's fully inclusive for everyone. So if you invest the time, and I think when I met you in Singapore, you were actually spending the first year doing reading. You were working fully on the reading at that time, training the teachers up. So there was a whole school literacy model and practice all the way through everybody. Because even students come in grade 6 and they may actually be from a language that it doesn't have letterings. They may be coming from Arabic or Mandarin backgrounds, and therefore they don't have a mastery of phonics, and they're in grade 6. So teachers even at that level need to understand how to accelerate phonics quite quickly so the children can get then into have word attack skills and be able to start reading, right? And do it in a very short time, because we don't have 2 to 3 years to do that. So literacy, and I said, I agree with what you're saying so much, that it goes all the way up to grade 8. Again, we have to put it into middle school, because and if we track it and we keep training. Now, the first year you did reading, was the second year that you focused a lot on writing?
Correct. So we had like a 3-year process, and we wanted to be very purposeful and very committed. But at the same time, people often kind of miss that point that in elementary school, you have one teacher who's teaching English, math, science.
Science,
So you
yeah.
cannot have too many competing demands happening at the same time. And when you think about literacy, it's not just one area. You have listening and speaking, you have reading, you have writing, you have word study, and they all require a slightly different approach. So we decided to focus on reading, just so that we can kind of make sure that the teacher load was manageable. And then it was something that we really wanted to perfect and do well, and be very kind of pointed in terms of our approaches. So reading was happening. It was a whole review process, looking at standards and all of that, and also alignment with our mission and vision, and then seeing what practices work in our particular context. So reading was year 1. Year 2 was writing, and focusing on, as I said, so reading, in terms of reading, what we focused on was guided reading, interactive read alouds, because it's so important for kids to hear proficient and fluent reading modeled, to see an adult who's actually engaged in the reading process, who is a reader themselves, and who wants to share this as a practice with their students. So those were the 2 things that we really kind of honed in on, and especially reading strategies. So every single teacher having a few, tools in their toolkit in terms of how do you teach main idea and supporting details? How do you teach determining importance? How do you teach inferring, and so on? So lots of really kind of cool, neat strategies that they could learn, and that are also bringing that consistency in approach. Because when you're, let's say, with Miss Francesca, and then you go to Miss Emilija's class, we need to have some alignment, because we're one school, right? So it needs to be working as a system. So that's why we wanted to make sure that teachers have consistent language in terms of the way that they were doing things, because that's extremely important for BMLs. If they've learned that this is what we call, inferring in grade 2, great. It's not reading between the lines, but you don't mention inferring, right? Because then it's confusing as a process. So just making sure that we had that understanding that language communicate something, and we shouldn't simplify it and dumb it down. It needs to be something that is respectful and to the level of expectations. So then once we had that as a process in year 1, we started year 2 with reviewing writing and our writing practices, and that was lots of fun, and I think I detailed that before. And then year 3, we had lots of focus on word work specifically, and how do we make sure we really hone in on these things that are kind of missing and lacking. And that included handwriting, that included starting from the early years as well, and having hands-on approaches to it, instead of being something that you do in isolation. It's integrated within reading and writing, and it's very hands-on, and it's very practical, and it's always at the end of that session, it's always implemented either when you read or when you write. It's not something that you do just for the sake of doing it, like a spelling test at the end of the week or whatnot, which is absolutely meaningless. So lots of also vocabulary. How do we, and everybody was going back to your research about, or actually I was trying to make a point. I was like, really, 30 words in 1 unit? Let's rethink that one. Or why do we need to teach it in isolation? Where is the context within this? So teaching vocabulary strategies strategies became the focus as well. So lots of things like that, but I think it's important for each school to kind of select and figure out where their strengths are and
Yeah.
start there, because there's lots of research that says if you improve writing, you improve reading, and if you improve reading, you improve writing as
That's
well as,
right.
they go hand in hand. And it's important to kind of find the best starting point for each individual context so that you can be the most successful, and you can keep people on board because they need that, I guess, sense of success that, they've tried something and it worked, and now they want to do more of that. So
Right.
celebrating small successes is super important in this whole journey, because people need to feel that what they're doing is actually making sense and having an impact.
Yeah, and having small steps of success and
Yeah.
celebrating them, because it is a bit of a journey. That leads me on actually to a really important thing, because you were there as a literacy coordinator. I mean, it was your full-time job to be the coordinator. Now, this was a massive school you were in. It was like there was 10 classes at each grade level. So when you were, and they were going from pre-K up to, I think it was grade 6. So you're talking,
Nursery, actually,
oh,
nursery
nursery.
all the way to the end of grade 6, and there were
Yeah.
2 campuses as well. Yeah.
So that was a huge, it was a full-time job. But when I go into schools, actually, generally when people say they have literacy coordinators in the school, it's almost like it's just a stipend role. They're doing a full-time teaching job, and then they're just doing a bit of literacy as in that type of role. So I think, would you say that one of the most important things schools need to look at in terms of really improving the academic success of their students is to have a literacy coordinator? And what does that role really look like? What would that mean? And what should they prioritize?
I think it's important for schools in general to consider their organizational structure and what are kind of the needs within their particular context. I know it's hard. You can have, all of these things that you want to have, but then at the end of the day, it comes down to budget, right? And reality. So, it's better to have something than to have nothing. In my current context, we have a head of English who's doing kind of that job, partly because she doesn't have enough of release time. So it depends what people call it. My job was curriculum coordinator with a specific focus on literacy, and then we had other areas as well. And because of the size of the school, we were 3,500 students. That made perfect sense for us. There's other schools that would have a curriculum coordinator, and then they would have a literacy coach underneath that. So it's very important, but the curriculum coordinator really needs to understand the role of literacy, the role of BML. So I think it's down to people. It's not down to the position, but do you have the people who are passionate and who are advocates for this? And I think those are the people that then, once you find that person, it's about creating the space for them and the time for them to work and function. So it depends if you are, let's say, in a small school in Europe of 200 students, maybe a full-time position is not necessary.
Right.
It's like very context specific as well. Also, the level of training of the teachers. Do they have sufficient training? Is that something that you're able to tackle in a different way? And then working from there. As I said, in our context, it worked in that particular setup. It's important to consider all the other things that are happening, but you always need to have a person who's the advocate and who's really passionate and pushing for that. And it cannot just be, it's important to have the person at the front. You can have many supporters and many people, and it's almost always like when you come as if everybody was just waiting for you to come, because they're like, oh, I'm so passionate about literacy, but I can't do anything about it. Or that person down the hall isn't doing it, and I'm trying to do this. So it's always that kind of context where people have the know-how, but they're not really given the time and the space. So it's important to kind of put your money where your values are, and what you value needs to be communicated in different ways in practice as well. So definitely having a person who spearheads the process is important. Not enough though. Then you need to continue to build, because it's not like you have a magic wand and it's just like all of a sudden, things start happening. You need to have really good relationships up and down as well. So it depends again who that person is, that is your line manager or the person that you report to, because without their support and encouragement and
Absolutely.
empowerment, things will not happen. You need someone, if you have that role is not going to be able to talk to the board members. They're not going to be able to represent. They're
right.
not in people's ears, right? They're not at the big table having those conversations once decisions are being made. So it's important to have that, good relationship, so that then people can actually, continue and spread the word and be their voice in places where they're not, so that you can have highest impact. Just having the position by itself is not going to
Yeah.
solve anything unless you are determined to put money into it in terms of resources, because you can't teach literacy without books.
True.
So convinced me how to do that. You
Yeah.
need a huge investment, and books are expensive. So you just, and I'm not talking about, just the library. You need to have classroom libraries. You need to have
Leveled books.
reading cupboards. You need to have all of these resources, high lows in terms of, so that you can attract and keep the interest of students. You need to have hands-on manipulatives. So all of these things cost, right? It's not something that, just happens. So investing in the resources and also having that voice and representation during the decision-making process, I would say, is equally as important.
I agree so much, because I see that as when I was a BML coordinator, that was my role. I was an advocate for every BML child that came into the school. I was there to not only welcome them in and find out where their classrooms were and liaise with the teachers, but also to talk to the admin about what resources, what scheduling, how do we invite the parents in and make them feel, all of that. It's so multi-layered, and you really need to be able, I mean, it just sounds, it's a huge task that people have to do, but I think it has to be done. You need to, as you were saying, you need to put value into that understanding. I mean, literacy crosses all of the domains, all the subject areas, and so
All the
that's
subject areas.
all of them is literacy. Yeah,
Because I keep saying this, and you touched upon it before, language and literacy are power structures. What that means is that they give you power to access certain aspects of society. And it's not important whether you're a BML or that the English is the only or the first language that you speak. If you're not literate, and when I say literate, I don't mean like first grade type of literacy where you can decode words. I mean like really media literacy, and literacy across the subject areas, across different domains, being able to be fluent in conversations about that, financial literacy at the same time. Though all of those things are created as almost, if you want to say, either it's a barrier to your success, or it's going to be a power structure that will allow you to access a higher level in how we organize ourselves in our society, right? So it's so important. And it's important for everybody to understand that it plays a part in every single thing that we do. Success in math, normally higher, but you cannot solve word problems unless you have language. Right? That's probably the only area where you can kind of, or music, where you can communicate a different way than using language. But language and literacy are a must. Success, let's say in my current context, our science, when our reading goes up, our science scores go up at the same time. And you have that positive correlation between them, not to mention social studies. You cannot function, if you cannot express yourself linguistically, I mean, everything is not going to work. It's going to go down the waste. Same from, 6th or 7th grade on. It's the same type of thing. I've supported students with their personal project, grade 10 student, let's say, who was really knowledgeable and really wanted to do so well. But if the language is missing, they cannot express what they want to express
so frustrating.
in the way they want to. And they get frustrated or discouraged. And it's about making sure that they have access to the right thing, because everybody wants to say it in a particular way. They want to convey a certain nuanced meaning, right? And nuanced meaning doesn't just happen like that. You really need to know the language in order to be able to communicate it the
To
way you want.
manipulate it.
Exactly. And the need is even greater, I would say, in the higher grades where, the positive self-image needs to be present, but it's often not because they're teenagers. So all of these things are kind of intertwined, and we just need to know that this is power. If you have this, and if you start earlier, even better, then you have access, right? Access to power. You hold the power, to kind of
That's so true.
convey certain things
That's very true.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, that's a great way to end. I mean, you really can't beat that, honestly. Isn't it so true?
Yeah.
It's so very true. So I just want to say thank you so much for giving up your valuable time. I really appreciate it.
Such a pleasure to have this conversation.
Yeah,
and
it's
to
great.
finally be able to put things out there so that they can get to people.
Yeah, that's what's so important. So thank you very much, Emilija. Thank you.
Thank you.